Brunelleschi's Renaissance by Andrea Feodorov. It's generally agreed that the Italian Renaissance lasted for 200 years, from the 15th to the 17th centuries. During that time, an unparalleled confluence of events, discoveries, inventions, artists, sculptors, painters, architects, and patrons converged in the city of Florence to end the Dark Ages and to revive the lost secrets of antiquity. These events were set in motion by a variety of factors, including the wealth of the Florentine patrons and their determination to establish a secular dynasty modeled after the dynasties of the ancient world. However, one man stands out as having the most influence on the origin of the Renaissance. That man was Filippi Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi was the man who discovered or rediscovered scientific linear perspective. He was a brilliant architect and engineer who in the early 15th century was tasked with building the dome on the Cathedral Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence. To aid in the construction, he devised a series of really ingenious tools, including a camera obscura, which he famously demonstrated inside the dark doorway of the Florence Cathedral directly facing the baptistry in 1420. By using a mirror with a small aperture and a hole through the painting, Brunelleschi was able to recreate an exact image of the Florentine baptistry in perfect perspective on a white sheet of paper. From there, it was only a matter of tracing the image to recreate its three-dimensional image on a two-dimensional surface. Needless to say, his experiments sent shock waves through the Western world and influenced all subsequent perspectival developments by artists and theorists alike. Without Brunelleschi, the Renaissance never would have reached the heights of human endeavor that mark it as a bellwether of Western progress. And the Dark Ages may have reigned for another 200 years. But that was not to be, for shortly after Brunelleschi's discovery, a young artist named Masaccio put Brunelleschi's theories to work. Brunelleschi may have discovered the vanishing point with converging lines to create a three-dimensional image on a two-dimensional surface, but it was Masaccio who demonstrated that every artist now had the secret to create realistic structures, architecture, landscapes, and figures. And Masaccio wasted no time. His frescoes, Expulsion from the Garden, the Tribute Money, the Holy Trinity, which adorned the walls of the Cappella di Brancioso in the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine in Florence, were the first attempt in 1,000 years to paint the human body naturalistically. His nude renderings of a distraught Adam and Eve broke with tradition by creating the visceral illusion of human form rather than the stylized, anatomically incorrect images of medieval and late medieval painters. You can see that the images are fully sculpted, with light correctly landing where they should on the sculpt, bringing out the sculpture. This is completely brand new territory in art. His command of perspective, his use of light, chiaroscuro for foreshortening, seen in his depiction of Christ and the apostles paying the tax collector in tribute money, were unparalleled. In the distance, you see it's a little bit blurry, a little bit blurred back there. As you come forward, you see the apostles in Christ very clearly. You can definitely see their anger with this whole decision being made about paying the tax collector. You can see Christ holding his hand. He's saying, no, 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 the man must be paid. And then on the right, in dark, you see the tax collector being paid. So it's almost like a triptych in a single fresco. His jaw-dropping use of Brunelleschi's perspective in the Trinity completely shook the art world and no doubt mesmerized the citizens of 15th century Florence, who must have wondered if they were actually looking at a painting or a portal into another section of the church. The dramatic effect of God, Christ, and the Holy Ghost, which is portrayed as the dove above Christ's head, before an optically perfect classic Roman archway, far surpassed any attempt at mathematically realistic perspective up to that point, and opened the door for generations of artists to expand on Masaccio's use of Brunelleschi's scientific perspective and resurrection of the secrets of antiquity. And yet, without the genesis of humanism, Brunelleschi's brilliant discovery, timely though it was, may only have enhanced the realism of religious iconography. As a movement, humanism was not new. It had been around since the 11th century, with scholars like Lovato di Lavati among the first to make a serious effort to imitate the style of ancient authors. What was new was the retranslation of Plutarch's Lives into Latin. Now, this was a language that could be understood by everyone in Florence. This brought the history of ancient Greece and Italy to all humanists and artists in Quattrocentro, Florence. In 120 CME in Greece, Plutarch had melded pagan wisdom and literature with Christianity, and by doing so, he legitimized the study of ancient writing and architecture and art. This was something that the Vatican could not argue with, right? This gave license to Renaissance artists and their secular patients to piece together the lost mysteries of ancient masters together with Brunelleschi's linear perspective, and it opened the door to a long forgotten past. Among the first to explore that past was Lorenzo Ghiberti. Unfortunately, when Ghiberti was doing this, he had little to go on. As Richard Kautmeyer, the art and architectural historian at the Institute of Fine Arts in New York, pointed out, the large bulk of Ghiberti's inspiration came from a dozen or so Roman sarcophagi. It was from these meager relics that Ghiberti fashioned a Hellenistic idiom that included contrapposto, the use of Brunelleschi's modular proportional systems, and the Pythagoro-Platonic ratios of the world soul found in Plato's Timaeus, which was also translated. So it was Plato who connected the dependence of beauty with the laws of musical harmony, and Pythagoras who taught that the key to understanding the universe lies in mathematics. And so the attainment of Plato's beauty, and indeed Pythagoras' mathematics, can be seen in Ghiberti's sculptures of St. Matthew, John the Baptist, and St. Stephen for the tabernacles of Or San Michele. His crowning achievement, the East Door, which took him 21 years, a 17-foot, 3-ton gilt bronze door depicting the narrative reliefs of Old Testament stories installed on the east entrance to the Florentine baptistry, drew on everything he learned about perspective, human anatomy, architecture, contrapposto, goldsmithing, and of course, the carvings of ancient Roman sarcophagi. By doing so, Ghiberti solidified the revival of Greek and Roman art in Florence, a revival that his apprentices were all too eager to join. One of those apprentices was Donatello di Nicola di Beto Barte, who is credited by the Metropolitan Museum of Art as being the greatest sculptor of the Renaissance, the early Renaissance. His passion for lost arts of antiquity was shared by Brunelleschi at an early age. They palled together. In his biography of Brunelleschi, Antonio di Tuccio Manetti describes the two men scavenging through Rome like treasure hunters in search of sculptures and buildings of the Roman past. Donatello must have discovered something during those treasure hunts because his sculptures were like nothing anyone in the 15th century had ever seen. His use of perspective and foreshortening, which considered the viewer's vantage, the space allotted to the sculpture, the ancient technique of contrapposto, where he has all his weight on one leg, and the human qualities he bred into his sculptures made Gothic sculptures look like they were just part of the architecture. I mean, there's no comparison there at all. And his first commission was this 5 foot, 2¼ bronze statue, the biblical character David, made by a technique known as lost wax casting. This was the first freestanding nude sculpture since classical antiquity. It's 1,000 years ago. The statue was greeted by awe at its unveiling by Florentine citizens who marveled at the almost playful contrapposto, which suggested the statue might walk off its platform at any moment. Donatello's David also embodied the spirit of democratic Florence. The victory of David over Goliath was seen as analogous to the city's recent defeat of the Duke of Milan. And it was a warning to any other enemies to steer clear of the city. His statue of St. Mark, commissioned by the linen workers in Florence, also used contrapposto. You can see he's leaning on one foot there, which is changing the angularity of his shoulders to bring his subject to life and imbue him with an aura of ancient Roman sculptures. St. Mark filled Florence with pride. Onlookers who gazed up at St. Mark in his niche at Or San Michele saw a figure that seemed to separate from the architecture, as if he too might walk away from his niche at any moment. Yet the credit cannot all be attributed to Donatello's early treasure hunts. He and many other Renaissance artists gained valuable exposures to classic works through the collections of the Medici family, especially Cosimo de' Medici. Oswald Sirén, the famed art research pioneer, is quick to point out the collections of the Medici were the center of all classical art education in Florence. The patrons and education of the classics drove the Florentine Renaissance to heights of human endeavor not seen for a millennium, and made possible geniuses like Donatello, Ghiberti, and of course, Brunelleschi. After Donatello's death, Lorenzo di Pier Francesco de' Medici chose Bartolo di Giovanni to act as curator for his sculpture garden, which was the de facto art institute of Florence, in the hopes that Bartoldo would cultivate the next generation of Renaissance geniuses. As Donatello's best student, Bartolo was well suited to carry on the legacy of his mentor. Among the artists he coached was a young Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simone, who showed great promise. Bartolo taught Michelangelo everything he could about sculpture, painting, perspective, poetry, and the lost secrets of classical Greek and Roman architecture. Little did he know his tutelage would lead to the destruction of his own legacy. Michelangelo never liked the idea that he was taught to be an artist, sculptor, architect, or poet. He preferred the notion that he was divinely endowed with the talent to create incredible works of art. He fashioned himself as a self-taught artist, divinely blessed with his abilities, and was very explicit that no one ever gave him any real training. Yet Michelangelo was a giant in the world of art, helping to move Florence from the Florentine Renaissance to the High Renaissance, on the strength of his genius and that of his contemporaries, Raphael, Leonardo, and the brilliant architect Donato Bramante, all of whom he despised. This was his first commission, was La Madonna della Pietà, completed before he was 30, immortalized the moment a dead Christ was given to his mother. Mary holds his limp body, pushing up against the flesh of his armpits with such realism. It's almost as if Michelangelo has turned marble into flesh. His statue of David was not only one of the most popular themes in Quattrocento Florence. At 17 feet, it was the first statue of such enormity since the days of antiquity. The perfection of David, naked at the height of his youth, in a relaxed contrapposto, with flawless anatomy, his right hand cradling a stone, his left hand holding a sling slung lazily across his left shoulder, eyes fixed on anyone who might consider an attack on Florence, immediately strikes the modern viewer. Yet despite its perfection, the public in 16th century Florence were a bit more concerned with its nudity. Within a month of its installation in 1504, the figure was kilted with a girdle of 28 gilded leaves. Nevertheless, Michelangelo's prolific talent was irrepressible. He studied the muscles and bones of dissected corpses, even in his late teens, made countless pen and ink renderings, which he often destroyed so no one could steal his concepts, and he worked incessantly. The dazzling complexity, beauty, and achievement of Michelangelo's fresco on the Sistine Chapel ceiling were completed in just 4 years. That's 5,700 square feet of intricate painting when he's on his back on a lift painting this in just 4 years. During that time, of course, no one had access to the chapel. It was restricted so that nobody could see his work. He was also commissioned to design and build a new St. Peter's and its great dome, which now draws thousands of pilgrims each year, but he never lived to see it completed. Before he died, Michelangelo burned hundreds of drawings and sketches so no one could pierce the myth that his talents were God-given or suggest in any way his debt to Bartoldo or Brunelleschi. Raphael never claimed to be divinely inspired, though you wouldn't have known it by viewing his extraordinary body of work. His application of Brunelleschi's science of linear perspective was mesmerizing. His use and understanding of light, color, anatomy, ornamentation, and his intimate knowledge of architecture, as seen here in the School of Athens, combined with his uncanny ability to show his characters' emotions and their interactions with the viewer, almost seem as if he served in multiple workshops in Florence. And he did. At a young age, Raphael was given what amounted to a passport to work in different workshops. By so doing, he absorbed a wide variety of styles and skills. I mean, Raphael knew everything everybody was doing in Florence. Another advantage he had was the fact that Donato Bramante was his uncle, and he was very well connected to Pope Julius II, having been commissioned by him to design and build a new Peter's Basilica with Michelangelo. Needless to say, Bramante and Michelangelo had totally different ideas for St. Peter's Basilica, and they despised each other with a passion. So in addition to the workshops in Florence, Raphael's uncle allowed him to surreptitiously view Michelangelo's frescoes on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And this also Raphael learned from. So he's got all the information of what the artists are doing in Florence, and he's got all the information on how Michelangelo is doing his paintings. So Raphael knows it all. This, of course, infuriated Michelangelo when he found out about it, and his hostility to Raphael was explicit. But Raphael, who by all accounts was gracious, generous, intelligent young man without malice or grudges, just never let it bother him. In his short life, Raphael painted dozens of Madonnas and was commissioned by Pope Julius II at age 25 to paint his new living quarters in a room that now bears his name, paint the Vatican Library, the Stanza della Signatura, with the aforementioned paintings, the School at Athens, the cardinal and theological virtues, the Parnassus, and the Transfiguration, all with a theme of wisdom because they were in the library. So the Pope was constantly looking at these images, which is exactly what he wanted. He wanted a break from the previous popes that had been all about violence and wars and everything else. He wanted a new perspective. Raphael had a workshop with 50 apprentices at one time. He created 10 tapestries, a medium he had no idea about, to line the lower part of the Sistine Chapel. He died tragically at age 37. But in those years, Raphael's flame burned brighter than most men twice his age. He may not have been divinely touched, but it's not hard to imagine that those who view his paintings weren't. Leonardo was in a class of his own. He had great influence on Raphael and also claimed never to be divinely inspired. Although if anybody had a claim to it, it was Leonardo. Although few men of his unparalleled genius have ever walked the face of the earth, Leonardo was the quintessential Renaissance man. a man with near universal skills, a term that could also be applied to great men of antiquity who used to have to master a wide spectrum of disciplines to be considered well educated. That's in stark contrast to our education system today, which prepares everyone for a specific, very specific area of knowledge with no regard to these other disciplines. Like scholars 1,000 years before him, Leonardo's notes show that he studied aerodynamics, architecture, astronomy, anatomy, biomechanics, cartography, chemistry, botany, engineering, optics, physics, sculpture, and of course, painting. It's interesting that a self-appraisal Leonardo sent to the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, during the Italian wars with France only briefly listed painting and sculpting among his abilities. I mean, he put it at the end. And yet, Leonardo is the artist who created the most famous and mesmerizing painting of all time, La Gioconda, Mona Lisa. Mesmerizing, perhaps, because of his use of sfumato. Sfumato is a painting technique in which the colors or edges are blended. It's been suggested that this technique was deliberately chosen by Leonardo to create a sense of turbulence in the eye of the viewer, and empirical data points to that conclusion. The painting appears as an undulating sea of shadows. And so they've used X-rays to look at it, and there's multiple layers underneath this in addition to the sfumato. So he's got the blended images along with these different layers underneath that. It just creates an undulating. So you're looking at it and it's not moving, but it's just, you can't put your finger on it. It becomes extremely mysterious. So before oil paints, artists used egg tempera almost exclusively. It had a luminous shine that stood up to humidity. The problem was that it notoriously cracked unless you applied it to wood surfaces. So you put it on a canvas, you're in trouble. Leonardo's Last Supper, which despite numerous restorations starting in the 18th century, which may have caused more trouble than it was worth, is a case in point. Leonardo painted the Last Supper in part with egg tempera. And today, less than the actual painting is really his original work. It's a real shame. He was also one of the first artists to experiment with oil-based paints, as you can see here, which I think also uses sfumato. The Renaissance was a turning point for all cultural and scientific inquiry in the modern Western world. It marked the end of a 1,000-year period of superstition and ignorance that followed the fall of the Roman Empire. Thanks to the Medicis, men like Ghiberti and Donatello, who reached back to the last known point of human sanity to start from scratch. Filippi Brunelleschi, without whom the Renaissance would never have happened as early as it did, and an unparalleled confluence of events. We live in a world of science and intellectual curiosity that might never have been. Works cited. Thank you for watching my presentation.